I did mention Italy and how that Italy was like the bad player on the Allies team. During World War II, I'm jumping ahead, I know, during World War II, Italy was such a bad helper that they cost Germany the war. In World War II, Italy joined the side of Germany and they contributed greatly to Adolf Hitler's defeat. And yes, they were actually on Adolf Hitler's side. Again, hopefully no offense to you Italians, historians blame the leadership and not the ordinary Italian soldier who did not lack bravery, did not lack honor, did not lack the courage or the will to fight, but the leadership in Italy was lousy. All right. I'm looking at page 667 right now. I got the Archduke assassinated. Once he was assassinated, the European statesmen spent a lot of time in worry and sleeplessness trying to figure out a solution. There seemed to be none. Austria received what you might call, your book calls it a blank check. In other words, basically Germany told Austria, just do what you want to do, and whatever you do, we're going to stand behind you. Blank check. In other words, don't ever give someone a blank check. You never know what they're going to write on it. In the case of Austria, they wrote down big world war and wound up getting clobbered. Anyway, the nations of Europe began to declare war. Your book doesn't mention this, but it was said that the lights went out all over Europe. One wife of a British statesman grabbed her husband, the two of them hugged each other and wept as war was declared, and the lady said, the lights are going out all over Europe. We'll never see them lit again in our lifetime. Well, the lights did come back on in Europe, but not as brightly. Europe ceased to be the center of world attention, and the world attention wound up focusing more on the United States and more on Russia and China. I know Russia's part of Europe, but more on the United States and Russia and China as time went on, and less on Europe. This story was in our high school textbook about two American boys. They were walking home from school. This was in the summer of 1914, and there were no school buses then. I mean, there weren't very many, if any. These boys were walking home from school. One of them said, "Hey, did you hear that the heir to Austria's throne and his wife were assassinated?" The other boy said, "Yeah, well, so what?" "Well, don't you realize that this means war?" The other boy said, "Well, okay, there'll be war in Europe. So what?" "Well, if there's war in Europe, the United States will probably get involved too." And the other boy said, "Europe can blow itself to 1,000 pieces. The war is none of my business." These two boys got to talking about baseball or about the upcoming activity of school and forgot about the events of Europe. Again, that's Americans for you. We still seem, as even as 2014, isolated from the events of the world somewhat. But the young boys and girls of Europe did not forget about it. Now, as for this young boy who said the war was none of his business, he died fighting in 1918 in France. Again, oh yeah, the date 1914 should be easy to remember because after all, this is 2014. That's the dates for the war. Come July, actually come August, not August, but come June 28th, if you're paying any attention, I'm sure there'll be a write-up in a paper that was 100 years ago the Archduke was assassinated. Come July, you'll be seeing that it was 100 years ago this month, that is the month of July, that World War I began. Almost 100 years. There are only 2 or 3 World War I veterans left in the world. From time to time you'll hear news that another World War I vet has died, and that includes all of them on all sides. Just 1 or 2. I think one of them is an American, the other one might be Japanese. Japan did get involved in the war, but not in a big way. When Europeans went to war in 1914, And I'm going to jump ahead and look. There's a picture on page 670 of a bunch of young men with their rifles going off to war and being greeted by the women folk. They acted like they were going off to a picnic. They thought that, well, okay, there'll be a war. All we need is one more war, and that will solve all the world's problems. Then we'll have peace. And this war would be short-lived, over with in a battle, just like the other ones had. Again, your book mentions how they thought that it would be a short war because the Crimean War had been short. The Franco-Prussian War had been short. The Spanish-American War had been short. The American Civil War, they knew had been long, but that was the fought on another continent. They believed they were in for a short war, one big battle of these men who were going off, you see, in such a big jovial mood, acting like they're going off to a big party. I can pretty well guarantee you not a one of them survived to the end of the war. World War I was called the war to end all wars. But from the time the war was declared in July 1914 until the present time, almost 100 years later, there has not been 1 second but what there hasn't been some war going on in some part of the world. War or a big threat of war, in most cases an actual shooting war has erupted. Anyway, the nations began to declare war. The Germans had a plan called the Schefflin Plan. The Schefflin Plan said that instead of fighting France on its border, and I think I mentioned this last class, we're going to go around the French border and we're going to go through Belgium. I mean, Belgium is a nice, flat, open country. And we'll get armies easily across through Belgium. Well, when they did, when they went through Belgium, a neutral country, which by all rights they should not have done, they did not know that Great Britain had made a treaty with Belgium some 60 years before, that if Belgium were ever invaded, Britain would come to their aid. So when Germany marched into Belgium, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The Germans said, oh, you're going to war over a slip of paper. The British thought this was arrogant. Anyway, the war had begun. And the war that was supposed to be a short-lived war turned out to be one of the, well, actually the most deadly war in history. If you look on page 668, you'll find a series of telegrams that were written between the Russian Tsar and the German Kaiser. These two men were first cousins, I believe on one of their mother's side, maybe both their mother's side, but they were related to each other. Both the titles Tsar and Kaiser means Caesar. You know, the Russians were claiming they were successors to the ancient Roman Empire, and therefore their emperor should have the title of Caesar. The Germans said, no, we're the successors of the ancient Roman Empire, and our ruler has the title of Caesar. Anyway, the impression I get when I'm reading these letters is you have two men who are, and I'm going to use my dad's term, two men who are itching for a fight. Each of them really trying to pretend at the same time that they don't want to fight. In effect, I mean, if you look at the letters, what they're saying to each other, the Tsar is saying to the Kaiser, it's up to you. The Kaiser is saying to the Tsar, no, it's up to you. The Tsar is saying to the Kaiser, I want peace. The Kaiser is saying to the Tsar, I want peace. And they both said, I want peace, but at the same time, if you decide to do this, there will be war. And the Tsar replied back, I want peace, but if you do such and such, there will be war. Again, both sides seemingly itching for a fight. In the course of time, both men lost. Oh yeah, it's true, Russia was on the winning side, but Russia lost badly. And of course, obviously, hopefully all of us know that Germany wound up losing. The people at the time believed that men were too civilized to fight. Now, folks, I want to, on a personal note, in 1971, I sat at the University of Tennessee, and we discussed the issue of are man's morals improving? Are we getting better morally? I had a communist professor. I mean, that's not knocking a man. I mean, he was an open, avowed commie. And even he did not take the viewpoint that our morals are getting better. He said that two things destroyed our view that morals are getting better. One was World War I itself, with its horrors. The other was the German Holocaust of World War II. That convinced a lot of people that, hey, our morals are just as wicked, if not more so than we've always been. Man has made progress technologically. We have better gadgets. But in 1914, they thought, well, as we've made progress technologically, so have we made progress morally. And there hadn't been a major war in Europe since the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. Oh yeah, Spain had gone to a short war with the United States in 1898, but that was involving the United States. So Europe had been at peace for decades, 33 years. Actually 43 years, 43 years of peace. We believed that our morals had improved, but again, this belief was challenged by the horrors of the Great War. Now, anyway, the war began with Germany's move through Belgium and into France. And there were two battles fought in a war called Battles of the Marne. The first Battle of the Marne was a German victory. Now, at the end of the war, they fought a second one, which was a German loss. But the first Battle of the Marne was a German victory. And here, when the battle was over, the French general telephoned back to Paris to his government in tears saying, we've lost the war. He believed the war was over because they lost one battle and it was all over. Well, instead, Germany did what they wound up doing at least 2 times later during World War II. Instead of pressing their victory, they paused and stopped to regroup. Now, folks, why would they stop to regroup? And I think, I mean, I've never been in combat, but I think I can understand why. Abraham Lincoln was really exasperated this from his generals. Every time they won a battle, they would stop and regroup. Well, it turned out the Confederate generals were doing the same thing. When the enemy army retreated, the generals would say, oh, thank goodness it's over now. And they wouldn't pursue the retreating foe. Well, why not? For one thing, all their men were scattered. And it's just like the men were going around, where's my outfit? Where's my outfit? None of them knew, the ones who survived, that is, were going around. The captains didn't know where their non-commissioned officers were half the time. And basically they had to reorganize and regroup. A lot of the equipment was broken down and they had to figure out how to fix it. So basically the German generals might have stopped just to regroup. But it was a fatal blunder because if they'd have gone and pursued, they could have whipped the British and the French right there. Instead, they paused, stopped, which gave the British and French the time they needed to reorganize. And you might say, dig in. Well, the war was fought on 2 fronts. The Western Front, that was the front between Germany and France, and the Eastern Front, that was a front between Russia and both Austria and Germany on the other side. But the Western Front bogged down into a 4-year-long trench warfare. And the trench proved to be the worst weapon that mankind had ever devised up to that time. What was wrong with it? Essentially this. You couldn't do without it. I mean, these were the days of machine guns, repeating rifles, and really heavy-duty artillery. And the only way you could survive was to dig yourself into a trench. But then the problem was, the trench guaranteed that the war was going to last and last and last and last, and keep on lasting some more. For 3.5 years, the war bogged down into trench warfare, and the trench wound up killing more people, perhaps, than the instruments of war. These trenches would come a rainstorm, they'd fill up with water and then collapse and crush the people to death who were inside them. Rats became a big problem, and sometimes it was said the rats got almost as big as cats, and even the cats were afraid of them. I mean, hey, it was horrible. The soldiers began to suffer from trench foot. Trench foot is caused by when you wear boots for days on end that are soggy and wet and can't take your boots off to dry your feet out, and can't dry your socks out. You get what's called trench foot, which cripples a person and makes them unable to walk. Now, to break the trench stalemate, these officers would sometimes decide, well, they keep wiring back to their commanders, we just need more men and more equipment. If we get a few more men, we can break this trench stalemate. The commanding officer would send them more men and more equipment, but it didn't break the stalemate. Now what they had a trench over here, 700 yards away would be the enemy trenches. In between would be an area called no man's land. And no man's land would be devoid of any vegetation, no human or animal dared to go onto it. But every once in a while, these armies would start firing at each other, particularly one in one each other, would fire a whole bunch of rounds at the enemy to supposedly soften them up. Then at a given signal, they'd all go what's called over the top. They just rush pell-mell over the top of the trench and rush pell-mell at the enemy. And this tactic never worked. It resulted in the deaths of almost everyone who went over the top. The officers were grieved themselves. I mean, they loved doing it. Okay, I mean, put it that way. But they had to tell the men, I've been told by my superiors, I have to send you over the top. What they knew was almost certain death. And once over the top, they're mowed down, your book says, like wheat on a farm, just mowed down and mangled. This was to last 3.5 years. And it was to wind up costing about 11 million casualties, soldiers who died in the war, not to mention the ones who were wounded. Your book winds up giving the figures. The big culprit that killed more, perhaps, than the trench or the bullets, well, maybe not more than the bullets, but one of the big killers was gas warfare. Now, I don't know what they train young people in the Army today, but when I was training in the Army, they gave us some training on gas warfare, and they told us that in World War I, 1/3 of the battle deaths were probably the result of gas warfare. And the Germans developed a really wicked gas called mustard gas. Now, I don't know if that's been deciphered, but they told us that no chemist had been able to figure out how mustard gas was made. It was called mustard gas because it was made from the mustard plant somehow. How is it put together? Now, maybe some of you know, but 30 years ago when I was in the Army, they were telling us that we did not know how mustard gas was made. Gas warfare was outlawed after World War I. And in World War II, it was not used. They decided it was too cruel, and even the Germans respected the treaty that kept them using it. But the gas warfare contributed greatly to the battle casualties of World War I.